All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're putting on our historical detective hats to figure out exactly why the modern spiritual map looks the way it does. We'll be digging through archaeological data, timelines, and human psychology to see how the world's belief systems actually evolved into what they are today.
To kick things off, let's look at this massive paradox. 80%. Right now, a staggering 80% of the global population follows religions that originated from just two incredibly tiny strips of land on Earth. Kind of wild, right?
So it begs the question, why these two regions? I mean, think about how just the Middle East and India effectively conquered the entire spiritual world. Throughout history, humanity has worshipped literally thousands of ancient gods. Yet almost all of those ended up as artifacts in museums, while the belief systems from just these two specific corridors didn't just survive, they completely took over the globe.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the staggering contrast. On one hand, we've got a graveyard of massive ancient religious empires. We're talking Egyptian, Greek, Roman, and Mayan gods. These were civilizations that lived and died by these deities. But today, they're just mythology. On the other hand, we have today's surviving faiths, all tracing their roots straight back to the Middle East and India. So why did one side collapse while the other endured? To figure that out, we literally have to go back to the very beginning.
Part 1. The birth of belief. We're traveling way back to a terrifying era of early human evolution to understand the psychological software bug that basically started it all. Picture this. It's 450,000 years ago at the Cima de los Huesos pit in Spain. Our source material describes this as an ancient crime scene, but really, it's the site of a massive cognitive shift in human history. Deep inside this 13-meter pitch-black pit, anthropologists found something that completely defied all biological logic. What they found were 28 hominid skeletons stacked deliberately, not just thrown in randomly, but deliberately stacked. And right beside them, one completely unused red quartzite axe. Now, in the brutal world of early human survival, spending hours crafting a weapon just to leave it in a dark hole with dead bodies has absolutely zero survival value. It makes zero biological sense. It's totally irrational for an animal. But it proves something absolutely incredible. Humans had developed abstract thinking. For the very first time, a species was telling a story about death. But with that incredible power of imagination came the absolutely crushing psychological weight of uncertainty and fear.
To cope with that sheer terror, our brains developed a pretty clever mechanism. Think of it like that famous psychological dot experiment. When humans are made to feel helpless and out of control, our brains literally start seeing faces and patterns in completely random static noise. Well, our ancestors lived in a jungle of pure helplessness where death was entirely random, so their brains forced them to see invisible patterns. A rustling bush wasn't just the wind anymore, it was a spirit. A storm wasn't just weather, it was an angry agent. This birthed animism. It was humanity's first psychological software, a stabilizing tool designed to give meaning to all that randomness and offer a sense of control over chaotic nature.
Part 2. Temples before the cities. Now, let's jump forward to 1994 in Turkey, where archaeologist Klaus Schmidt discovered Göbekli Tepe. This is a complex of 20-ton stone pillars built 12,000 years ago. And here's the mind-blowing part. They were built by hunter-gatherers who didn't even have the wheel or agriculture yet. For decades, we assumed cities were built first, and then, people had the free time to build temples. Well, Göbekli Tepe proves the exact opposite. Temples created cities. The evolutionary pressure to feed the massive crowds of workers coming together to build these huge ritual centers, that's what actually accelerated the invention of farming. But they couldn't just settle down anywhere. 3 massive evolutionary forces were forcing humanity's hand here. First, the Ice Age ended, which gave us a much more stable climate. Second, our massive sources of meat, megafauna, like the woolly mammoth, went completely extinct. And third, humans had spread so far across the globe that continuous migration just became completely impractical. These 3 forces converged with maximum intensity in only 2 places on Earth, where wild wheat and barley grew naturally: the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East and the Indus Valley in India. Basically, humanity was trapped into settling down right there.
Part 3. The trust crisis.
Now, settling down actually unleashed a pretty deadly problem. Farming meant humans suddenly had to live in massive groups, which exposed a fatal flaw in our social software. We call this Dunbar's number. It's the cognitive limit to the number of people a single human can maintain stable, trusting relationships with, and it caps out at exactly 150. For millions of years, hunter-gatherer tribes functioned beautifully under this limit. Everyone knew everyone. But farming suddenly exploded those populations. Early settlements like Çatalhöyük ballooned to 8,000 people. Suddenly, you're living surrounded by 7,850 complete strangers. The old jungle spirits couldn't police morality in a sprawling city like that. So trust completely evaporated. And this brilliantly illustrates the resulting bloodshed, which was just staggering. When archaeologists examined 93 skulls from Çatalhöyük, 25 of them had deep weapon fractures. That is a horrifying 25 out of 93 fracture rate. To put that into perspective, if you compare that to modern murder statistics, we see maybe 5 or 6 murders per 100,000 people. The sheer scale of social chaos and violence in these early cities was absolutely unreal. Then add the economic reality to the mix. The Gini coefficient measures inequality. In hunter-gatherer societies where meat spoils quickly and you can't really hoard wealth, inequality was just 0.17. But with farming, grain could be stored for months, it could be hoarded, it could be stolen. Inequality skyrocketed to 0.46. The incentive to cheat and steal just went through the roof, completely shattering whatever human trust was left. Humanity was quite literally tearing itself apart. Part 4. Temples as first institutions. So how did we survive this? Well, organized religion evolved. Not just as a place for prayer, but as civilization's very first administrative patch to fix this broken social software. When trust between humans broke down, they had to place their trust in something higher. Let's walk through this timeline. 12,000 years ago, we had ritual centers. Fast forward to 8,000 years ago, and as offerings kept pouring in, they needed a way to track them, so we see clay accounting tokens. By 5,500 years ago, this tracking evolved into cuneiform writing. And by 3,700 years ago, we get written law, like Hammurabi's Code. The temple was slowly morphing into the central hub of all human coordination, scaling trust across thousands of strangers. I absolutely love this next fact. We always tend to assume that early writing was invented by these romantic philosophers writing ancient poetry. Not even close. 85 to 90% of early cuneiform tablets were essentially just ancient HR spreadsheets. No joke. The first professional priests were basically ancient accountants tracking vast resources, literally recording exactly which laborer got how much beer and barley. Because they controlled the resources and the records, the temple effectively became the first state. Think about it. They became the first banks, literally charging 20% interest on silver loans and 33% on green. They became the first courts. If you had a dispute, the priest read the tablets and delivered a verdict on behalf of the gods. And they created the first monarchs, establishing the divine right of the priest-king. When you couldn't trust your neighbor, you trusted the temple. This made it the blueprint for all modern institutions.
Part 5. The Great Divergence.
So the crucial point here is how this exact same institutional law played out in two completely opposite ways. The pressure was identical, but the Middle East and India took vastly different paths to solve it. Over in India, we hit what's known as the Indus Valley Paradox. You have these massive cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. We're talking about an advanced civilization of millions of people. They had underground sewage systems, standardized brick sizes, the whole shebang. Yet archaeologists have found zero evidence of centralized temples or supreme autocratic kings ruling over them. So how on earth do you manage millions of people without the rigid centralized authority we saw in Mesopotamia? It remains one of history's greatest mysteries. And this architectural mystery perfectly mirrors their religious evolution. The Middle Eastern path chose absolute centralization. Over time, they simplified things down. One God, one book, one centralized truth, which of course led to monotheism. But the Indian path? They chose extreme decentralized pluralism. They multiplied into 330 million gods. No single fixed book, no single centralized authority, but rather a belief that all these millions of gods were just different manifestations of one universal truth known as Brahman. Now, what is truly fascinating here is the sheer survival power of both distinct frameworks. The centralized Middle Eastern model was incredibly effective at expansion. It successfully converted massive ancient empires, Egypt, Rome, pagan Europe, and today it accounts for about 55% of the world's population. Meanwhile, the decentralized Indian model was incredibly effective at resistance. It uniquely repelled conversion for thousands of years, absorbing the shocks of Alexander the Great, the Mughals, and the British, maintaining an impressive 80% domestic retention rate today. Which leaves us with a truly profound question.
Of all the thousands of belief systems humanity created to cope with the terror of the unknown and the chaos of those first cities, why were these two exact blueprints, the hyper-centralized and the hyper-decentralized, the only ones capable of surviving to run the modern spiritual world? The ancient Egyptian and Roman gods are sitting in museums, but the psychological software coded in the Fertile Crescent and the Indus Valley thousands of years ago is still secretly running the lives of 80% of the globe today. So the next time you look at our modern institutions, ask yourself, how much of our present is really just a ghost of these two ancient pasts?